I thought it was about time we covered the aliens with so much personality that they change Ben's. Or at least for the most part. Aliens like this are an element of the series that have always sort of been around, particularly if you stretch how literal we're being with our interpretation of aliens with a lot of personality, but we'll get more into that as we go along. For the most part, these are a batch of alien transformations who, for whatever reason, belong to species that all share personality traits so strongly that it's in their DNA. It's not a cultural thing from the homeworlds, it's well beyond skin deep. I'll be largely grouping these and covering these aliens per series. I'd highly suggest you stick around for the last alien on this list, come Omniverse, being the most out there and unusual on this list. A small aside, but I'd regret it if I didn't bring it up, Ghost Freak. At least at the time, this was less the transformation itself, it's the transformation's DNA source, Saskia, who through having his DNA inside the Omnitrix became trapped in it, and through that, trapped in Ben, and in one instance, took over Ben. Resulting in one of my favourite scenes to use as B-roll in videos, where Saskia controlling Ben as Ghost Freak absolutely brutalises the Circus Freak trio, who from then on are absolutely petrified, and rightfully so, of Ghost Freak. That and the rest of the episode from that point is just a great example of the classic series, particularly the moment we get the reveal of Ghost Freak or Saskia's true form. But I've gone down a bit of a side tangent there. Let's move on to alien transformations that more consistently change Ben's personalities rather than sort of once-offs. Sticking with the classic series here, we get an alien whose abilities kind of inherently change the way Ben approaches situations, along with being one of the two that most change the way he not only behaves, but how he fundamentally thinks. This one's pretty straightforward, being one of the smartest transformations in the Omnitrix. The only real difference it makes to Ben beyond being a tiny little frogman is his intelligence, and with that, Ben carries himself differently. He's more analytical and kind of mentally detach himself from situations, and for the most part, leans away from Ben's more emotional way of thinking and becomes a more logical kind of character. That and his speech pattern changes pretty drastically, which, thinking about it now, is rather different from the other Galvins we see in the series, but maybe that sort of comes down to his intelligence being new to Ben, while it's more a matter of fact to an ordinary Galvin who's not just a Galvin for a few minutes at a time. Moving on to the one other example in the classic series that affects how Ben carries himself, we've got Ditto, who, I'm sorry for this, I didn't plan this pun, but somewhat stretches the definition of changing Ben's personality. Unlike Grey Matter or even Ghost Freak, Ben isn't possessed, nor should his thinking really change all that much as Ditto. Despite now being able to multiply himself and have all sorts of parallel thoughts, that isn't the thing that changes him, he just does inherently act differently. And in reality, I'm sure Ditto's personality comes down to the fact that he looks so similar to Yakko from the Animaniacs, who so happens to have the same voice actor in Rob Paulsen. I'm now realising I've brought up Rob in 2 videos that Ditto came up in a row, but when you're going over an alien that just oozes this much personality, especially when that personality comes so much so from the voice actor, it only feels right to bring it up, even if it's twice in a row. Back to the design itself briefly, apparently there was no direct reference to Animaniacs when Tom Perkins came up with Ditto's appearance. Starting off strong with these 3, I think they each individually represent a different way Ben's personality can be affected by different aliens. And I'm seeing a pretty clear pattern we're following with the classic series and Alien Force, where we've got Ben's personality being affected by another ghost alien. Ben even bringing out the comparison in series when he starts to lose control of himself, being forced into Big Chill's transformation. At first, Ben only being affected when transformed into Big Chill, then it's a pretty quick escalation from there to being forcibly changed into Big Chill when using other aliens. In a far less horrifying turn of events than what we saw with Saskia, all the odd goings-on happening with Big Chill turn out to be a result of the species' reproduction cycle, with Big Chill's DNA being compelled to start eating as much metal as possible in order to build a nest so that they could lay and look after their eggs until the baby Necrophrygians were born, which thankfully for the 20-odd minute runtime of the episode, happened pretty quickly, ending with Ben now being a parent and no longer having to worry about what was going on with Big Chill. I really thoroughly enjoyed this episode especially. It had a really nice build of tension before that eventual release, with finding out how harmless it all was. All this really aided by what happened in the classic series, leading Ben and us as an audience to suspect that we're just sort of retreading old ground here. Next on our list before we get into the sort of big Alien Force entries, we've got Brainstorm, and not to repeat myself too much here, but we've got pretty much the same setup as we had with Grey Matter, having the way Ben carries himself and the way he interacts with others be so different down to a newly found superintelligence. Though, unlike Grey Matter, the cadence and speech pattern Brainstorm has seems to be more universal amongst the species, or at least with Dr. Psychobos, who, despite being a bit of a character himself and having a pretty distinct accent, does feel like he shares more character traits with Ben as Brainstorm than Ben as Grey Matter does with Azimuth or Albedo. Now one of the two sort of major entries, but one I hadn't really considered putting on this list until halfway through researching for this video. We've got Alien X, who I realise how liberal I'm being with who I am and aren't including in this video. This transformation less affects Ben's personality, but quite literally introduces two personalities to Alien X that join Ben in there, with Ben's consciousness now making up a third of Alien X. In case you're not aware, Alien X is made up of Serena and Bellicus, who, in order to use Alien X's abilities at all, must come to an agreement before taking any action whatsoever, typically leaving them at a standstill due to their opposing personalities, making Ben's inclusion, in theory, a great tiebreaker for them. Creating this enormous, seemingly infinite weight on Ben's shoulders, especially with Ben, if not for Professor Paradox, being made to remain as Alien X indefinitely. Even then, introducing us to the idea that Ben, if ever backed into a corner without any other options, could choose to give up functionally his life in order to borrow Alien X's abilities. You had the ultimate answer to any conflict that would functionally result in no more Ben beyond his consciousness. A bit of an aside from the personality theme of this video, but I feel the need to mention how well the introduction of Alien X elevates just how powerful and conceptually out there future transformations could be. Let's not get too far into the setup of Alien X outside the personality aspect, since that deserves a video in itself, but for now we'll leave it there. Before we really get into the meat and potatoes of this video, let's jump around a bit from series to series. Still in the Ultimate Alien Force era, we've got another situation with Ben completely being taken over by an alien's consciousness, only in a particularly out there way with the introduction of the Sentient Ultimates. But before we get into that, if you're enjoying this style of content and sort of like what I do here, please subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, great, we'll continue the video. With the inciting incident of the episode resulting in Ben losing control of his Ultimate Humongousaur transformation to the now sentient Ultimate Humongousaur trapped inside the Ultimatrix, it's more akin to Zascare's influence on Ghost Freak than it is Big Chill's DNA influence, and while pretty hostile, a lot more rational than Zascare, with the Sentient Ultimates being convinced that Ben's sacrifice would result in their freedom from the Ultimatrix. Theoretically, any of them probably could have taken over Ben, but for whatever in-universe reason besides him being the series mascot, Ultimate Humongousaur was sort of the de facto leader, I suppose. Moving on to the alien that inspired this list in the first place, and a personal favourite of mine, we've got Wrath. There's something so punchy about how immediate the change into Wrath is. There's no gradual influence with this species. When Ben transforms into Wrath, he really is Wrath. He's this hyper-charming, hyper-aggressive, no-nonsense wrestler stereotype. That sort of snap change from Ben to Wrath is so much more so than the others on this list. Each of the aliens on this list sort of change how Ben carries himself and how he interacts with others, or any given situation, but Wrath feels like his own little guy. He's not a separate entity from Ben, and he's not Ben, he's sort of this in-between. I think this change is made all the more memorable by his introduction making him the second alien on this list to have Ben being forcibly stuck as this transformation for the majority of an episode, the first being Grey Matter. Wrath's personality being down to being an amalgamation of Wolverine, Hulk, and Hulk Hogan, which is a pretty interesting mix that turns out to mesh pretty well. His speech patterns being a blend of the way the Hulk refers to himself in the third person, carrying himself as this sort of poorly speaking meathead, while his catchphrase, "Let me tell you something," is a reference to Hulk Hogan's nearly identical catchphrase in "Let me tell you something, brother." And speaking of the way he speaks, this is another transformation, like Ditto, who heavily owes a lot of his charm, even beyond a regular alien transformation, to his voice actor in John DiMaggio. Another quick aside, it'd be easy to cover the Benton characters John doesn't voice, especially during the Ultimate Alien Force era. It's just that Wrath is, for me, the perfect alien for John. But back to what makes Wrath Wrath in series. His species is the main factor here. It's not like a brainstorm or a grey matter with Ben becoming more intelligent. This species makes Ben aggressive, and I don't want to say directly less intelligent, but his decision-making is certainly clouded by how aggressive Apoplexians are. Their whole culture is based around fighting. Any conflict can be solved with yelling and punch-ons, having their main form of chat being yelling. All this to say, Wrath is that perfect shining example of aliens that belong to species that personality traits run so deeply that it's in their DNA. Moving on to Omniverse, we've got a somewhat mixed bag of personality-filled aliens. These three all kind of fall under an umbrella category of aliens with particularly distinct voices. Not to get too ahead of ourselves, but to tease and sort of touch on all of them a bit, Atomics is this futuristic Zap Brannigan type. Shock Squatch is so inherently Canadian that I find it amusing, and Bullfrag is this sly Stallone sound-alike. We'll get started with the one with the least reason to make it onto this list in Shock Squatch. There's not a lot to say here, I just wanted a reason to discuss why there's an alien species who so clearly has a Canadian accent. You could argue a bunch of aliens have whatever accent the voice actor may have, But Shock Squatch so heavily leans into that Canadian accent in a way that I really get a kick out of. And before we move on, I just really want to point out how so much of these aliens' personalities come down to stellar voice work. Back to Atomics, who probably has a more justifiable place on this list, with a pretty obvious shift in the way Ben behaves. He becomes this ultra-theatrical, almost shonen protagonist type. His vocabulary totally shifts and even changes how he refers to others. That and he becomes super dramatic, naming his attacks, again in a very shonen kind of way. In researching for this video, turns out that shonen comparison is more appropriate than I realised, with the way Atomics charges his attack being based on Goku's Kamehameha. Otherwise, his voice is eerily similar to the Batman Brave and the Bold's take on Aquaman, or Captain Laserbeam from Thrilling Adventure Hour. But I've always felt like he was a bit of a Zap Brannigan type, as if Zap from Futurama clambered into a robot suit and was bigging himself up a bit with a bit of bravado. And finally, like I mentioned at the start of this video, Bullfrag, who along with being a later addition to the series, brought with him a very distinct personality, being so much so separated from Ben that the series used this as a way of hiding Ben as an incursion double agent in his debut episode, with characters as close to him as Gwen and Kevin not realising it was Ben at first, particularly Kevin. As I said earlier, his personality and mannerisms were based on Sylvester Stallone, and canonically, for whatever reason, Bullfrag is Ben's most handsome alien, according to Derek J. Wyatt. The most major change here, and we're at this point in this video, is that Bullfrag, not Ben, Bullfrag is attracted to Empress Ataya. Ben as Bullfrag even saying,
"Don't blame me, blame this DNA."
Ben in his human form actively not being interested. Anyway, that's my very hodgepodge list. A few of these grouping aliens together videos sometimes stretch the rules a bit for the sake of it, but this one's really all over the place with what I have and haven't included. If you feel I've missed any or even feel some of these shouldn't have made it, let me know. Otherwise, if you've made it this far into the video and aren't subscribed, please do so. And if not, either way, I appreciate you being here. Thanks for watching.
Okay, thank y'all for watching.